The photograph was face down. That's what I noticed first. Not the silence when I walked in, not the way my mother moved slightly to the left when I entered the kitchen. Just the photograph, the one that had sat on the windowsill above the sink for 11 years, lying flat on the counter, face down, like someone had set it down in a hurry and forgotten to pick it back up. It was a photo of me and my brother Marcus at my high school graduation. I was 17. He had his arm around me and was grinning like he'd personally built me from scratch. I didn't say anything about it. I poured myself water. My mother asked how the drive was. I said fine. That was 3 weeks before I found out what she'd done. I should explain something about our family before this makes any sense. We were 4 people in a 2-bedroom apartment in Trenton for most of my childhood. My mother, my father until he left, me, and Marcus. Marcus was 6 years older and had, by the time I was 12, already established himself as the person my mother organized her world around. That's not bitterness talking, it's just accurate. He was louder, funnier, more present. He called every Sunday. He remembered her birthday without being reminded. He was the kind of son that made people say things like, "Your mother must be so proud." I was the kind of daughter who studied. I don't say that like it's a tragedy. I liked studying. I liked the quiet of it, the way a problem would sit still while you worked on it. By 16 I was taking AP courses at the community college 2 towns over. By 17 I had a near-perfect score on the SAT and a math teacher named Mr. Ferrara who told me, without ceremony, that I should apply to MIT. I remember laughing when he said it. He didn't laugh back. I applied in November of my senior year. I told no one except Mr. Ferrara, which should have told me something about the kind of house I lived in. My mother's reaction, when I finally mentioned I'd applied, was not what I'd hoped for. She didn't say I couldn't do it. She didn't say it was a bad idea. She said, "That's far," and then changed the subject to something Marcus had done at work that week. I was used to that. I filed it away. The letter was supposed to come in mid-March. I checked the mailbox every day for 2 weeks. I had set up an online portal, but I'd read on forums that the physical letter often arrived before the portal updated, and I don't know why, exactly, I wanted to hold it. Whatever it said, I wanted to hold the actual paper. On March 14th, I came home from school and the mail was already on the kitchen table. My mother was at the counter cutting something. She didn't turn around. "Anything interesting?" I asked. "Just bills," she said. I remember checking the pile anyway. Electric bill. A catalogue. A dentist reminder. I told myself it just hadn't come yet. The portal updated 4 days later. I was sitting in the library at school, 5th period, when my phone buzzed. I'd been accepted. I sat with that for a moment. Then I texted Mr. Ferrara. Then I cried in the bathroom for about 6 minutes, which felt exactly right. Then I went to AP Chemistry and couldn't absorb a single word. I came home to tell my mother. She was on the phone with Marcus when I walked in. She held up one finger, "Just a second," and I waited in the hallway, my backpack still on, the biggest news of my life sitting behind my teeth like a stone. She finished the call. She put the phone down. I said, "I got into MIT." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "How much does it cost?" And I told her I'd gotten a substantial financial aid package, that I'd already looked into loans for the rest, that Mr. Ferrara had explained everything and there were additional scholarships. "We'll talk about it," she said, and went back to the counter. We never talked about it. Or rather, we had a version of the conversation, 3 times, in increasing levels of tension, over the next 2 weeks. She said the cost was too uncertain. She said I was too young to take on debt. She said Rutgers had a good engineering program, it was 40 minutes away, she knew people there. She said a lot of things that sounded, on the surface, like practical concern. She never once said she was proud of me. I told myself that was just how she was. That she showed love differently. I had been telling myself that for years and I was, by now, very practiced at it. Then, one evening in late March, I went looking for the acceptance letter, the physical copy I'd never received, because I needed it for a scholarship application. I checked the mailbox. I checked my room. I checked the kitchen drawer where my mother kept important documents. I found an envelope, or what remained of one. It had been torn, cleanly, deliberately, into 4 pieces, and placed in the drawer beneath the takeout menu, face down, like a thing that was supposed to have disappeared. The MIT letterhead was still visible on the largest piece. My name. The date. The word congratulations. I stood in that kitchen for a very long time. My mother was in the next room watching television. I put the pieces back. I closed the drawer. I went to my room. That's when I realized something was very wrong. Not just with the letter. With all of it. With the way she'd moved when I walked in that day. The photograph face down. The just bills. The weeks of conversation that circled the same drain and never resolved. She hadn't been weighing the decision. She had already made it. And she had done it quietly, without ever giving me the chance to fight for myself. I thought about confronting her that night. I thought about walking into that room and putting the pieces on the coffee table and asking her to explain herself. I didn't. Because I was 18, and I didn't yet know how to separate anger from strategy. I knew that anything I said in that moment would become a scene she could reframe, absorb, and survive. She was very good at that. She had been doing it my whole life. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. Here is what watching looked like, practically speaking. I went to Rutgers in the fall. Not because I had made peace with it, but because I had no money of my own, no backup plan, and a mother who had, without ever raising her voice, closed every other door. I told myself it was temporary. That I would transfer. That this was a detour, not a destination. And I kept watching. The first real piece of evidence came not from my mother, but from Marcus. It was the summer after my freshman year. I was home for 6 weeks, working a cashier job to save money. Marcus came for a long weekend in July. On the second night, after my mother had gone to bed, we sat on the back steps the way we used to when we were kids, him talking, me listening, and somewhere around midnight, after enough of the cheap beer he'd brought, he said something he clearly wasn't planning to say. She was scared you'd leave and not come back. I asked him what he meant. He got quiet in the way people get when they realize they've said more than they intended. He said he just meant she worried. That she'd missed Dad, and then she'd worried about missing me. That it wasn't personal. I asked him if he knew about the letter. A pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. What letter? I watched his face. He was a decent person, Marcus. But he was not a good liar. And in that 2-second pause was everything I needed to know about how much he'd already known. I didn't push. I said goodnight and went inside. The second piece came 2 years later, when I was 20. I had, by then, quietly rebuilt. I transferred into Rutgers Honors Program. I applied for every grant and fellowship I could find. I got a research position that paid better than the cashier job. I stopped going home as often, which my mother called distance and I called survival. That year, I was sorting through documents in her kitchen during a brief visit. She'd asked me to help organize some paperwork for a refinancing, when I found a folder tucked behind a binder of utility records. Inside it were financial documents. Specifically, records showing a joint savings account that had been opened in my name without my knowledge when I was 16. A college savings account. I want to be careful here, because the amount matters. It wasn't a fortune. It was just over $19,000. But $19,000, added to the financial aid package MIT had offered me, would have covered the gap. The loans I'd been told were too uncertain. The ones my mother had cited as the primary reason I couldn't go would have been manageable. Possibly unnecessary. The account had been closed the summer before my senior year of high school. I noted the account number. I photographed the document with my phone. I put the folder back exactly where I found it. I finished helping her with the refinancing. I ate dinner. I drove home. The third piece took another year to surface, and it came from the least expected direction, my niece. Marcus had married a woman named Diane when I was 19. They had a daughter, Priya, who was by then 4 years old and already unnervingly observant. I loved her immediately and completely, in the straightforward way you sometimes love people who haven't yet learned to be complicated. I was at Marcus and Diane's house for Priya's birthday when Diane pulled me aside in the kitchen, ostensibly to help with the cake. She had the look of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for a long time. She said, "I don't want to get in the middle of anything." I told her she could say whatever she needed to say. What she told me, carefully and without editorializing, was this. She had overheard a conversation between my mother and Marcus approximately 3 years earlier, before Priya was born, before Diane and I were close, in which my mother had said, plainly, that she had handled the MIT situation, and that Marcus had nothing to worry about. Marcus had not objected. He had said, "She'll be fine at Rutgers." Diane had never brought it up because she hadn't known what it meant at the time. It was only later, after Diane and I had grown close, after she understood more of the family's history, that she realized what she'd heard. She apologized to me, which I thought was generous of her, given that she had done nothing wrong. I told her I wasn't angry. That was mostly true. So by the time I was 21, here is what I had. A torn letter, photographed and stored on an encrypted drive. Financial records showing a college savings account closed in the summer before my senior year. A second-hand account of a conversation in which my mother described destroying my opportunity as something she had deliberately handled. And a brother who, at minimum, had known enough to lie about it and had chosen, quietly, to let it stand. None of this was illegal. I want to be honest about that. Morally, it was a kind of theft. She had stolen a future from me, or at least altered it significantly, but the law doesn't have a charge for a mother who intercepts her daughter's mail and redirects her life. What it meant, practically, was that a courtroom was not the destination. Something else was. I just didn't know yet what form it would take. I only knew that I was not going to spend the rest of my life eating quietly at holiday dinners while my mother accepted praise for how well I turned out, as if she'd had anything to do with it. And I knew something else, too. Something that had been forming slowly in the back of my mind since Priya's birthday, since I'd watched that little girl run across the backyard with her arms out like wings, uncomplicated and fast and entirely herself. I knew that whatever I decided, it had to protect her. Confronting them would have ruined everything. I graduated from Rutgers at 22 with a degree in electrical engineering and a job offer from a firm in Boston I had spent 2 years quietly positioning myself to receive. Boston was deliberate. I want to say that clearly. I chose it because it was close enough to MIT that I could audit evening lectures through a cross-enrollment program I'd found my junior year. I chose it because the firm had a tuition reimbursement policy that would let me pursue a graduate degree. And I chose it because it was 4 hours from Trenton by car, which was far enough that impromptu visits required planning. My mother said, "That's far," which was what she had said about MIT 4 years earlier. I said, "I know." The plan, if I'm honest about when it became a plan rather than just a slow accumulation of decisions, formed fully in the year I turned 23. Priya was 6. She had started asking questions the way 6-year-olds do, without any filter between the question and the asking of it. During a visit that fall, she sat next to me on the couch while I was reading and said, "Are you smart?" I told her I worked hard, which I thought was more useful. She thought about this. Then she said, "Grandma says you went to a school that wasn't as good." I kept my face very still. I asked her what else Grandma had said. She shrugged the way children shrug, total, boneless, already moving on. Just that. And that Marcus went to the right school. Marcus had gone to community college for 2 years and then worked his way into a logistics management role through sheer persistence, which I respected. But he had not gone to a school that was, by any metric, more rigorous than Rutgers. The narrative my mother had constructed, even in the telling of it to a 6-year-old, had a specific shape. Marcus had done things correctly. I had been steered correctly. Everything had worked out. What I felt, sitting on that couch, was not anger. It was something quieter and more purposeful. It was clarity. I was not going to let Priya grow up inside that story. I started with the documentation. Everything I had already collected, the photographs of the torn letter, the financial records, Diane's account of the conversation, I organized into a single encrypted folder, time-stamped and backed up in 2 separate locations. Not because I planned to use it legally. But because I had learned, by then, that the value of evidence is not always in its deployment. Sometimes it is simply in the knowing. In having the record exist somewhere outside your own memory, where it cannot be revised or minimized or explained away. Then I called Diane. Not to strategize. Just to talk. We had been growing closer for 2 years by then, and Diane was the kind of person who understood things without needing them spelled out. I told her I was thinking about Priya's future. I told her I had been putting money aside. I told her that I wanted to be the person in Priya's life who made sure that when the time came, no door was closed to her because of money, or fear, or someone else's decision made quietly in a kitchen while Priya wasn't looking. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much are you thinking?" I told her my number. She said she'd match it. We agreed not to tell Marcus yet. Not because we were excluding him, but because Marcus had a particular relationship with his mother that made him, in certain situations, unreliable. He loved her. He deferred to her. And if she found out what we were doing before it was done, she would find a way to make it about herself, about ingratitude, about family loyalty, about all the things she had sacrificed, and the conversation would become about her instead of about Priya. We had both seen that happen before. Over the next 4 years I did the following things, none of which were dramatic, all of which were intentional. I maxed out my contributions to the 529 account Diane and I had opened jointly for Priya. I advanced at the firm and then, at 25, enrolled in a part-time master's program in electrical engineering at Northeastern, which my employer covered 60% of. I took on freelance consulting work on evenings and weekends and put every dollar of it directly into savings. I lived modestly, not miserably, but modestly, in a way that felt less like sacrifice and more like construction. I visited home 4 times a year. I was pleasant at dinners. I asked my mother about her garden, her friends, the shows she was watching. I listened to stories about Marcus with the same expression I had practiced for years, attentive, warm, present. She told me once, during a Christmas visit, that she was glad I had settled down. That I seemed more at peace than I used to be. I thanked her. I was not more at peace. I was more focused. They are different things, but they can look identical from the outside if someone isn't paying close attention. She had never paid close attention to me. The year Priya turned 10, I sat down and did the math for the first time in a formal way. I pulled up the account balances, ran projections based on moderate growth, and calculated what we would have available by the time she was 18. It was enough. More than enough, actually, if she was strategic about applications, which I fully intended to help her be. I called Diane that evening. I told her the number. She was quiet for a long moment and then said, "She has no idea." I said, "That's the point." Priya was 10 years old and somewhere in Trenton she was doing her homework and probably asking questions that her grandmother was already quietly shaping the answers to. She had no idea that 2 women, one of them her mother and one of them an aunt she saw on holidays, had been building something for her in the background for 4 years. She had no idea that the story she was being told about her family, who had done things right, who had been guided well, who had made sensible choices, was missing entire chapters. She would find out eventually. When she was old enough to understand it, and when the understanding would be useful rather than just painful. My mother called that same evening, as she did every other Sunday. We talked for 11 minutes. She mentioned that Marcus had gotten a promotion. She asked if I was seeing anyone. She said the weather in Trenton had been strange. I said all the right things. I said goodnight. I hung up. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. Priya was 12 when she told me she wanted to be an architect. We were walking through the public garden in Boston on a Saturday in October, just the 2 of us. Diane had dropped her off for the weekend, something we had made a quiet tradition of. Priya stopped in front of the footbridge and stared at it for a long time with the particular concentration she got when something was working on her from the inside. She said, someone had to decide exactly how that curve would look. Someone sat down and figured out the math for it. I told her that was exactly right. She looked at me. Did you always know you wanted to do engineering? I thought about how to answer that honestly without giving her more than she needed at 12. I told her I had known early that I was good at it, and that someone had believed in me when I was young, Mr. Ferrara, though I didn't say his name, and that his believing in me had made it easier to believe in myself. She nodded like she was filing it away. That evening, after she was asleep on my couch with her book still open on her chest, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the account balance on my laptop for a long time. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With something more like resolution. The feeling of a thing that has been in progress for years finally becoming visible. The conversation with Marcus happened the year Priya turned 14. Not because I had planned it for that year specifically, but because Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening, unexpectedly, and within 3 minutes had mentioned, casually, the way people mention things they assume you already know, that their mother had been helping Priya think about colleges. I asked him what that meant. He said she'd been talking to Priya about staying close to home, about state schools, about how important it was not to take on too much debt too young, about how, when you really thought about it, the name on the diploma mattered less than people said. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Marcus, I need to tell you something." And I did. Calmly, without accusations, without the torn letter or the financial records or Diane's account of the overheard conversation. Not yet, not over the phone. I simply told him what I knew. What I had found in the kitchen drawer 7 years earlier. What the savings account records showed. What his 2-second pause on the back steps in July had already told me he knew. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "She was afraid of losing you." I said, "I know. That doesn't make it." "I know," I said again. We stayed on the phone without talking for almost a full minute. That minute held a great deal, years of Sunday calls and holiday dinners and careful silences and the particular exhaustion of loving people who have hurt you and not knowing what to do with either feeling. Finally he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't want to do anything to her. I told him I wasn't interested in confrontations or confessions or apologies that were really just performances of apology. I told him the only thing I wanted was for Priya to have every door open to her that should have been open to me. And that if he wanted to be part of that, I needed him to make sure his mother's voice was not the loudest one in the room when Priya started making decisions. Another silence. Then, "How much have you saved?" I told him. He exhaled slowly. Diane knew about this. Diane built it with me. I could hear him processing that. The fact that his wife had known for 4 years, had sat across from him at dinners and said nothing, had made her own quiet calculation about what he could and couldn't be trusted with. I don't think he was angry. I think he was recognizing, perhaps for the first time with any real clarity, how much had been managed around him for a very long time by the women in his family, in different directions and for different reasons. He said he wanted to contribute. I said we'd talk about it. Priya was 17 when she got her scores back. She was sitting at my kitchen table. She came to Boston most school breaks by then, had her own drawer in my guest room and a favorite mug she kept in the cabinet, and she opened the portal on her laptop and stared at the screen. Then she looked up at me. I already knew what the numbers were before she said them. I had been watching her work for 5 years. I had sat with her through calculus and physics and the particular despair of the practice test where nothing clicks and you wonder if you've been wrong about yourself all along. I had told her, each time, what Mr. Ferrara had once told me, "Keep going." She said the scores out loud. Her voice was very steady. I said, "Those are good numbers, Priya." She said, "Good enough for where I want to apply." I said, "Tell me where you want to apply." She had a list. It was a good list. It included several schools that would have made her grandmother nervous, far away, expensive sounding, the kind of names that carried weight and implied distance. At the top of the list, written in her careful handwriting, was a program at a school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I did not say anything about MIT. I did not make it about myself or my history or the letter in the kitchen drawer. This was her list, built from her own wanting, and it deserved to stay that way. I simply said, "Let's build the applications." She got in. Not to MIT. To her first choice, a 5-year architecture program at a school in Chicago that had accepted 11% of applicants that year. Full financial aid package, partial merit scholarship, a gap covered entirely by the account Diane and I had been building since Priya was 6 years old. We told her about the account on the evening the acceptance came through. All three of us, me, Diane, Marcus, sitting in their living room in Trenton while Priya read the offer letter for the third time. When we explained what we had done, and for how long, and why the gap was already covered, she looked at each of us in turn with an expression I won't try to describe because I don't think I have the words for it. She asked me, specifically, why. I told her that someone had once made sure a door was closed before I could reach it, and that I had spent a long time deciding what to do with that. And what I had decided was that the most useful thing I could do with it was make sure no one did the same thing to her. She didn't ask who. She was 17 and perceptive, and I think she had already formed her own quiet theories about the shape of our family. She would understand more when she was older. There was no rush. She just nodded, and leaned over, and put her head on my shoulder for a moment the way she used to when she was small. My mother came to the dinner we held that weekend to celebrate. She was gracious about the acceptance. She said Chicago was far, but she supposed that was how it was now. She said Priya was talented. She said the family had done a good job with her. She did not ask how the tuition would be paid. Perhaps she assumed it was loans. Perhaps she had decided, as she often did, that the practical details were someone else's concern. Or perhaps, somewhere in the back of her mind, she had begun to understand that things had been arranged in ways she had not been consulted about, and that the consultation had been withheld deliberately, as carefully and quietly as she had once withheld a letter from a mailbox in Trenton. I don't know what she understood. I didn't ask. We ate. We laughed about something Priya said. Marcus poured wine. Diane caught my eye across the table at one point and held it for just a second, and in that second was everything. 4 years of saving and calculating and staying quiet and watching a little girl grow up with every door still open. I looked away first. I picked up my glass. I was 25 years old and I had a master's degree and a career I had built from the narrow starting point someone had given me without my consent. I had a niece who was going to Chicago to study how buildings hold themselves together. I had done what I set out to do, not in a courtroom, not in a confrontation, not with a speech or a revelation scene, just quietly, persistently, over time, the way you solve any problem that matters. My mother said something funny and the table laughed and I laughed too. That night, everything was quiet.